dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, brought to you by 3 self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Pioneers. Today's TEFL Pioneer is Robert Phillipson. If you're not familiar with Robert Phillipson, he is a pioneer really in the field of critical applied linguistics rather than TEFL. But it is very connected to TEFL. So Robert Phillipson was born in 1942 in England. He graduated from Cambridge University, which is pretty impressive.
Yes, I suppose so.
It's better than Newcastle or wherever you went to. I don't know. And he joined the British Council he worked as a British Council officer for quite a long time in the 1970s.
So a British Council officer?
A British Council officer, someone who travels around, does curriculum projects, things like that. I think he wrote textbooks in the 70s and 80s as well. I seem to recall that. But what he's most famous for is the concepts that resulted from his PhD work at the University of Amsterdam. So in his PhD, he argued in favour of the idea of linguistic imperialism. Have you heard of that term at all?
I've heard the term, yes.
Yeah? So what do you understand by linguistic imperialism?
Over to you, Matt.
Oh, right. Linguistic imperialism, let me see. I imagine it means, well, I suppose it can mean a couple of things, but maybe much like maybe a form of or a subset of cultural imperialism, where a culture of a country or a nation state with maybe not strictly classified as an empire, but or maybe including that, but with imperialistic tendencies, is spreading its culture all around the world.
Right.
And then I imagine a linguistic form of that would be perhaps maybe the imperialism about imposing a particular language on a group of people.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay. It's a form of a kind of a neo-colonialism. Yeah. So he argues that English has been pushed by organisations such as the British Council, who he used to work for, but now he's turned on them. Like, is there like an analogy to that in Star Wars, like the turning on the Empire? Darth Vader did that, didn't he, at the end? At the very end.
Yes.
So he's the Darth Vader of the British Council.
Okay.
And so he argues that the British Council was or is involved in the promotion of English as a way of promoting Western neo-imperial control over countries in Africa, Asia, and so on.
Yeah. And Tatooine
as well. Yes. Right. Yeah.
Well, that particular act of betrayal took place on the second Death Star near the moon of Endor. But
anyway, back to
the moon of Endor, though.
The forest.
back to. This world.
So this was his book was published in 1992, but I think that a lot of the things that he spoke about in it are still quite relevant for today. So he says that there are 5 tenets of ELT, which the industry is structured around, and which are kind of core principles of linguistic imperialism. So maybe we'll just go through the 5 tenets.
Okay.
So the first tenet is that English is best taught monolingually.
Right.
So he thinks that this supports linguistic imperialism because it means that you don't have to involve foreign languages in it, essentially. You don't have bilingual education, you just have the pure monolingual experience. Yes. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it kind of ties into the talk that we had with Claire Cramch when we spoke to her.
Yeah, which the listeners won't have heard yet.
Yes, I know, but as a little preview. Right. She wanted to reposition learners as, emerging bilinguals rather than deficient users of the L2.
Yeah.
And so I think, she would probably agree that maybe this is... probably this idea, maybe he's not saying this, but I usually think this monolingual idea, it's from method logical purposes, or it's for pedagogical purposes rather than imperialistic purposes. But it ties into...
Yes, yeah. I think that Michael Swan said that it's very convenient that all the methods that we've come up with involve us not having to learn any foreign languages.
Right.
So that's the first tenet of ELT, according to Phillipson. The second one is that the ideal teacher of English is a native speaker, which he, again, says is part of this method of control. So you can't have people from these countries controlling the English education policies. They need outside influences coming in, helping them to shape their curriculums, and therefore promoting linguistic and cultural interest.
This seems slightly outdated these days, right?
Well, I don't know.
Even the model of the native speaker is being challenged these days.
Yeah, it's being challenged, but would you say that it's not dominant still?
Oh, yeah, it is, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, the context we're in Japan, the native speaker is seen as the person who can present communicative competence,
right?
Conversation, for example. That's still largely the case, but I think it's being challenged more these days.
Sure. Yeah, I think it is.
Certainly.
It is being challenged. I mean, his book was originally published in 1992. He did bring out a sequel recently called Linguistic Imperialism Continued. It's quite a weak title.
Episode
Son
2,
of Linguistic Imperialism?
Return of the Linguistic Jedi?
The Return of the Son of the Bride of Linguistic Imperialism. Yeah, that was in 2009. So
so it's fairly recent.
Yeah, even that's 5 years out of date. He was mainly talking about Africa and Europe. It should be mentioned rather than Asia, but I think still a lot of this applies. Yeah. The third tenet of ELT is that the earlier English is taught, the better the results. And we discussed this in the last episode.
Yeah. And we also discussed it with Claire Cramsh.
With Claire Cramsh, yeah. Spoiler alert. I mean, this is basically what it says. I don't think it's necessarily true that the earlier English is taught, the better the results, but it is quite convenient if you're a neo-colonial power to kind of hook kids on the stuff at a young age. Yeah.
I mean, but there is evidence that does help learning, right?
Well, he's
coming at it from. I guess he's coming at it from a slightly different angle. Not the case that you can improve your English this way. Just the whole overriding trend that you should learn at an earlier age. I guess he's coming at it from that.
Yeah, and also there's research which says it's not.
Yeah,
right, okay.
yeah. There's research on both sides. Yeah. I think there are generally advantages to learning at a younger age if you get lots of instruction, but not all the time and not in every
Sorry, it wasn't Claire Cramsh, it was Nina Spada.
Nina Spada.
Not to name drop, but...
Another spoiler.
Another spoiler. But yeah, didn't she report on results that said that actually...
She did,
Some studies said that maybe the later you start, or not the later, but starting at a later age.
Yes,
Anyway, tune in to the interview to find out more.
Yeah. But perhaps just don't unsubscribe. The fourth tenet of ELT is the more English is taught, the better the results. So I think, again, we could argue that this is true in a sense. If you teach more English, people will probably learn more English.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can unpack that a little bit and talk about what's meant by taught.
Yes.
It may be a case that so-called teaching, up to a point is beneficial, and then letting go and letting students go off and do their own thing in the target language might have even better results. So I think even that could be challenged.
Well, I think it could be, yeah. I mean, I think that what he's trying to argue is that it's more about pushing the language, essentially trying to get people very, very familiar, immersed in the language, so as to propagate the language, so as to propagate the linguistic imperialism. I think that's what he's basically doing.
I guess these are 5 ways, 5 arguments as to why English is regarded as being this imperial commodity.
Well, these are kind of
eat English, drink English, learn it from a young age.
Yeah,
do everything in English.
Because I mean, in both of those last two, he's not saying the more English is learnt, the better results. He's saying specifically is taught.
Yes,
I think it's an important part of it.
Yeah. And the final tenet was if other languages are used much, the standard will drop. So again, this is kind of similar to the monolingual fallacy, which is what he calls it. If you teach other languages alongside English, then the standard of the English will drop. Which he says is a way of suppressing local languages in favour of English. What do you think?
I don't know about the context he's talking about. I mean, specifically Africa. in my experience, that hasn't come across as a tenet
Right.
of VLT, but maybe in some context it is.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think the trend these days, if we're talking about like lingua franca, is to kind of absorb these other languages. English is not, English is ever present, but also English is adapting to take in these other varieties.
Right.
And that seems to be more of a fashionable trend for me at the moment, rather than denying that all these other languages are being suppressed in some way.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting that we're talking a lot about how maybe some of his ideas don't apply today. But of course, he wrote this more than 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps his writing and his theories and the influence that he's had are one of the reasons that the landscape of ELT is changing in that way.
Yeah,
I think that the work of people like him and Alistair Pennycook and Adrian Holiday, I think that those people are making or are influencing research and influencing policy towards a more fair and more equitable system, I guess.
Yeah. So he presents one side of the argument, essentially. Yeah.
He does, yeah. And we've presented a bit of the other. Okay, and that's the TEFL pioneer for this episode, Robert Phillipson. TEFL Cultures.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL Cultures, I'd like to talk a little bit about, well, I guess it's perhaps a subgenre of a CLIL approach. Are you familiar with what CLIL means?
Yeah,
I think so.
It's content and language integrated learning, I believe.
That's right.
Yes.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so it's an approach in which a foreign language is used as a tool in learning of a non-language subject. So, for example, science or maths. So basically, language and the other subject have a joint role.
Right.
Basically, CLIL is kind of used as a tool towards globalization. So, for example, Japan is encouraging their students to or institutions to undertake CLIL approaches to sort of get Japanese students on a level playing field with other kind of ESL speaking countries such as Germany or Sweden or Spain. I'm not going to talk too much about CLIL today. Perhaps we'll talk about that in another episode. I'm going to talk about a particular approach that's being used within CLIL.
Right.
Basically. Are you familiar with reacting to the past?
I'm sure I've heard that at a conference or something, but I wouldn't be able to talk about it.
It's often Matt?
No.
So it's often abbreviated as RTTP.
RTTP.
Probably doesn't make it any easier. So, that one, yeah. It's recently moved into English teaching, but it was originally an approach in history classrooms in the US.
Okay, interesting.
So it started by a guy called Mark C. Carnes, pronounce it like Carnes, a professor of history at Barnard College.
Barnard
College. Okay. In the late 90s. So what Carnes, sorry, not Barnes. Where was I? What Carnes argued was that a lot of students or generations of college students today have built and inhabited subversive play worlds that are distinct from the official institutions of higher education.
Right.
So basically what he means is students are on their phones, they're in Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're going to parties, and they're not really involved in the classroom.
Right.
Essentially. And he wanted to think of a way in order to get students more engaged with the content of a class, essentially.
Yeah.
So he, especially with history lessons as well, he kind of saw history is often presented by the teacher. Maybe there's some discussion about the topic, but usually the students don't really have a chance to fully engage with the subject matter.
Right.
It's quite two-way, or one-way even.
Yeah.
So he started this approach called reacting to the past, which basically uses role-playing games.
Okay.
It's basically based around games, history games.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, for example, they'd recreate events in history and get the students to play characters.
Okay.
So, for example, take for example Henry VIII.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Henry VIII?
Yes.
He had many wives.
He did, yeah.
6.
So
Clearly, you've got an A in A-level history.
So there's one game that's available called Henry VIII and the Reformation of Parliament.
Right.
And this would be a game that you'd you'd buy, perhaps.
Yeah.
You take to the students, and then you'd probably use over a whole semester.
Right.
Okay.
So it's actually a whole semester approach.
Right.
And the students getting fully engaged over the semester.
Yeah.
So I'll just give you a bit of the blurb of this particular game.
Yeah.
Victory is up for grabs because the King's Party is in fact a coalition of 3 dissimilar factions whose members are further divided by personal ambitions and jealousies. You're hooked. At issue is the clash of 4 contending ideas: medieval Catholicism, Lutheranism, Renaissance humanism, and Machiavellian statecraft. So you can imagine you've got the 4 or 5 different positions there, which the students would take in their classes.
Right.
Basically, and perhaps what you'd get the students doing is you'd get them. What they have to do is they'd have to take the beliefs of these figures, so they'd have to assume the identities of these figures.
Right.
Perhaps it depends what the focus of your class is, but if it's for presentations, they could be addressing Parliament, for example.
Yeah.
They could be involved in interviewing the other side.
Yeah.
And by the end of the semester, they would have fully engaged in the topic and the content, essentially.
Right.
So just what do you think of this approach in general at the moment?
Perhaps I'm not quite seeing exactly how it would apply to ELT. I mean, it sounds really interesting. I'd love to do Henry VIII and the murdering of spouses. I think that'd be a good game.
This is just one example. I mean, regarding Japan, recently some designers have created a game called The Legacy of the 47 Samurai.
Okay, the 47 Ronin.
47 Ronin,
right.
But they've called it 47 Samurai. So obviously it has, in terms of the students' own lives, perhaps you can adapt it to have a bit more contextual significance to their own lives, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the idea of this is it's basically one example of a CLIL approach.
Right.
It's essentially a history
Right.
example.
Yeah, I think anything that grabs the students' interest and gets them engaged in the lesson is great. And yeah, I mean, my understanding of CLIL is that there are maybe strong forms of CLIL and weak forms of CLIL.
Yeah.
And it seems it seems maybe there's more focus on language, depending on the approach to CLIL that they take. But I think you could easily tie in certain, if you wanted to, tie in certain forms, grammatical forms, or vocabulary.
I think
family groups,
I think that's what they're arguing. I think they're arguing that there are texts that come with the game set, essentially. So there are texts to read. There's obviously information to rely on. And they have to use the correct information, obviously.
And it would be very interactive. The Henry VIII game you described.
Yeah, I mean, I just so for example, if you were going to do this with a group of learners from one particular country about one particular point of history or whatever, I mean, there would be, I guess, a lot of very technical vocabulary. Is this an approach that's only suitable for quite high-level learners?
Well, essentially, this was started probably with first language speakers, essentially, or speakers in multilingual settings or plurilingual settings. Yeah, it would be a challenge in certain countries, such as Japan. I know they're trying to push CLIL a lot, possibly in contexts where I think students are not quite ready for CLIL.
I think they use quite weak forms of CLIL.
So it'd have to be a very weak form and very kind of watered down approach, I guess.
Right.
And also, I think the teacher would have to be very up on their history. I don't think the teacher could kind of take up the game and just go along with it. They'd really need to know the ins and outs and how it works to actually be a real setting.
Right.
As possible.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, this approach it's received awards for its innovation, and they've produced a series of games currently. So that's how this kind of works at the moment. People are producing a series of games, which you can take on for an entire semester or module of teaching.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting, for example, in a high school, if in the students' history class, once a week or something, they conducted it in English. So they could look at the same topics that they were looking at in Japanese, but in English. Some kind of connection like that, or universities a similar thing with their degree subjects.
Yeah. So if the second language input follows the first language subjects, you mean, right? Yeah. I think that'd be interesting,
Yeah, so that's today's TEFL Cultures.
TEFL News.
this week's TEFL News is a report on a paper that was published earlier this year, I think in the spring of this year. It's tangentially connected to TEFL, as these news items often are.
Yeah, and I think most of what we talk about.
Right. But I think it has maybe some obvious connections too. So the paper by 3 sociolinguists at the University of Texas at Austin, it was published in the Journal of Language and Social Psychology. The title of the paper is, and everything I say from now on is going to be the title of the paper.
Okay.
Who like says you know? Filler word use is a function of age, gender, and personality. Is the title.
Okay.
No, I'm not saying the title.
All right, okay, I was going to say, well, it's going to be a 10-minute title.
Right. The whole rest of the segment is the title.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so the title is Who like says you know? Filler word use is a function of age, gender, and personality.
Okay.
So basically, what they were looking at was how the frequency of filled pauses, so things, basically pauses, uhs and ums,
right,
and discourse markers, which is what they identify the phrases I mean, you know, and like.
Right.
They identify them as discourse markers.
Okay.
How it varies with, they looked at 2 basic demographic variables, gender and age, and personality traits.
Yeah.
So looking at basically who uses these phrases.
Yeah.
By age, by gender, and also by personality.
Right. Okay.
So what they did is they recorded and transcribed interviews with a bunch of speakers. I don't know how many, and they looked at these transcriptions, and they found that these markers are used most frequently by women and girls, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do you think that might be?
Well, that's interesting. Well, another important part of the study was the personality traits that they looked at.
Yeah.
And they found that the use of discourse markers especially was particularly common among the speakers who scored in terms of personality test as what they defined as conscientious.
Right.
Conscientious was defined as people who are more thoughtful and aware of themselves and their surroundings.
Right, okay.
Yeah. I don't know how they determined this. I don't know exactly what kind of personality test they did. But so what they did then is they tried to look at why are people, especially women and girls, who are using these discourse markers, or these you knows, ums, you like, you know,
yeah,
I means,
fillers,
yeah. Why they identified, or why they were shown to be, or discovered to seem to be, at any rate, conscientious.
Okay.
What they decided was, or what their conclusion was, is that so these discourse markers, which is what they called them, basically showed that the speaker had a desire to share or rephrase opinions to their recipients.
Right.
In other words, they were thinking of the effect of their words on the person who they were talking to.
Right.
Just showing this kind of conscientiousness.
So the rephrasing is kind of a courtesy in case people didn't understand them, or in case people misunderstood them or misunderstood their intention?
Yep, that's part of it.
Right.
So using phrases like you know or I mean,
yeah,
maybe they'd rephrase things. Also, what they felt that they were doing using words like was just indicating that what they were saying it may not be 100% true.
Okay.
And
make terrible liars.
Yeah, well, exactly. So conscientious people probably would make terrible liars. So they're not trying to pretend that what they're saying is accurate.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think maybe a consequence or an interesting point for language teachers is how much do we want to make our students aware of these phrases? Do we want to teach our students to use these phrases?
I find that students tend to pick these up over time. So my very high level students, they throw in like a lot more often than like I do.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, they throw it in a lot, and it's because they've heard people say it. I guess people their own age when they were studying abroad or whatever.
Yeah.
And then they've incorporated it into their system, and they just use it for whenever there's a break, basically. It's like if you get very low proficiency users, they sometimes put so or and between every other word. And I think they do the same thing with like. It's an all-purpose filler.
Yeah.
So I think maybe we'd want to be aware of, we'd want to work at making them aware of the pragmatics of its usage, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I see.
These were first language users?
Yeah.
In America?
Right. In America,
right.
I believe. Yeah.
I see.
What do you think? Do you think you'd want to teach your students these phrases? If, for example, if you knew that they were planning to go study in the States, where these phrases are very common?
Yeah, I mean, like like I just said. I'm very conscientious. I think it's a great marker of fluency. It obviously makes them sound more fluent, more natural.
Yeah.
Perhaps they need more thinking time in English, and rather than using what they would do in their first language, which is what some of our students do, they use
Eto. That's a Japanese one, by the way.
the first language. It makes them sound a lot more fluent, and perhaps they can keep face when they're speaking to somebody in America, perhaps. And I guess it's a politeness strategy as well. Arguably.
I wonder if this has changed over time, because obviously "like" is quite a modern word. I wonder if the number of fillers has increased over time, or if just the words have changed. I mean, it's difficult because we don't have many examples of spontaneous speech from the 1800s or whatever. But I wonder if there has been a change, or if people just used to lie a lot more back then, and now they're more conscientious.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's very hard to know. Obviously, our view of how people spoke in the past is from written records or those kind of things.
Or very stilted audio recordings.
Yeah, so we tend to assume that people spoke more eloquently, maybe, or fluently.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in materials or in dialogues, when a teacher's writing a dialogue, how often would you put things like "I mean," You'd probably leave it out and just focus on the content.
I have put them in sometimes, but it's always been there for a specific purpose. Like, is there to indicate a lack of understanding or perhaps indecision. So I do sometimes use them, but they're more for a specific purpose.
Yeah. I mean, actually, interesting. The article in which I found this, or the article which wrote about this paper, was by a guy, very interesting writer. Maybe some of our listeners know Adam Gopnik, who writes for the New Yorker.
Right.
And he started by pointing out or comparing it to, and sometimes in not classical, but in older literature.
Yeah, old books.
Yeah. There are examples in speech. I mean, this dialogue in books isn't very natural, but you would pick up words, and one of them was the phrase "as it were."
Oh, okay.
So people would, as they'd speak, and so as it were, I da da da.
Yeah.
And he said a like is basically just an update of an old timey "as it were."
Yeah.
As it were.
As it were.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, that's more of a Northern English way to use it.
Yeah. I remember when I was young, I used "like" a lot. I still probably use it too much, but I used it a lot. And I remember I was going to an interview for a kind of posh school.
Yeah, kind of.
And the only advice my father gave me, and I was 11 years old, the only advice my father gave me before I went, he said, "Stop." He said, "I've never told you this before, but stop saying "like" so much." And I did, during the interview. He scared me enough that I didn't use "like" that much. And I think use it less than I used to, but it used to be a kind of, it was, one of those every other word things almost.
Well, it was interesting that you just said then, I still use "like" probably too much. What do you define as too much? What standard are you applying there?
Yeah, that is interesting, because I think maybe one reason that this paper gained some publicity is that people tend to think of these phrases, teenagers saying "I mean," "like" so much as a very negative thing, and people think, it's the dumbing down of culture and all these things.
Yeah.
And I was aware that I didn't want to sound like the type of person who would use "like" a lot.
Right.
So what's it?
What type of person's that?
Yeah, I don't. Well, that's for you to decide. But maybe people think that if you do use those phrases a lot, you are, even in the first. For us, it sounds less eloquent or less fluent.
Yeah.
Perhaps. So in that case, is it something we want to teach to our students and encourage them to do?
Yeah.
Maybe make them aware of it. Because I think, especially when students are listening to first language speakers speak, they need to be aware of, you know what I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They need to listen, well, that's not important. I need to listen to the content of what they're saying.
Well, perhaps we also need to focus on register a little bit. I mean, if you're speaking with your friends, you can speak like this. If not, you should try not to. I mean, I think that I'd find that very difficult. I mean, I find it difficult just to switch between polite and normal Japanese. So I think I'd find it very difficult to make these very small changes, especially when they're just a part of fluency, when they're a part of something you're meant to be doing unconsciously. I think I'd find it quite difficult to do, but perhaps that's something, as you said, it's important to make students aware of.
It's like you were doing just then. It's a way to break up your ideas, I guess.
Yeah.
You break up your clauses, perhaps. Like
Right.
and then there's a new idea, and then another idea, sort of thing. Like, maybe,
Sort of thing, like
Yeah.
maybe
Like, so I wonder if the opposite, on the opposite, like a very unconscious speaker.
a very unconscious speaker.
Well, that
We're going right down a meta rabbit hole.
would maybe not break up their speech at all.
Yeah.
And just speak in one long stream, and it would be very hard to understand what they were saying.
Right. So it is needed, perhaps.
Yeah.
For other reasons. Like.
Yeah. It is very interesting. Like.
So that was today's TEFL news.
Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can now contact us via Twitter. You can follow us at TEFLology. We also have a Gmail address, teflology@gmail.com. Okay, so we hope you tune in again next time.
So it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.